Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 753 lecture. So we'll be talking about authenticity and significant properties, two very important and really interesting aspects of digital preservation. So our weekly topics for this week are: what determines the significant properties of a record? How are significant properties related to authenticity? And what role does authenticity play in digital preservation? And so in addition to these topics, we'll also look at how we can relate the ideas of authenticity and significant topics to other concepts and topics and subjects that we have discussed throughout this course. So a little bit of a cherry on top of our weekly topic Sunday. Okay, so we'll start with just a quick review of some of our earlier talks about digital preservation. So early on in the course, we talked about how preservation really is focused on preserving the context and the content of records. And surrounding this concept or this need are some questions like, what do we need to preserve? How do we know that? How can we support authenticity? And what are the pros and cons of doing so? And the discussion of authenticity and significant properties is related to these questions. So the question of what do we need to preserve can be correlated to which properties or aspects of a record do we need to make available for researchers in the future. How do we know that? How do we go about determining which properties or which characteristics of a record really are the important ones that we should focus our time and energy on? How can we support authenticity? So how can we go about making sure that our records are as authentic as possible? And which aspects of a record are more important when thinking about authenticity and how to preserve the authenticity of a record? And what are the pros and cons of doing so, of supporting authenticity? We'll talk about the idea of permanence and the resource-intensive nature of retaining the significant properties of a record, whether they be related to the content or context of a record, and how that can impact an archives. Okay. So here are some definitions of significant properties from the Becker article. So what I want to talk about is how these significant properties can be related to both the content and context of a record. So I think when people oftentimes think about the significant properties of a record, they tend to think about the content of the record. So the image that you see in a digital image file, the sound that you hear when you play an MP3 or a WAV file. But I would argue that in a lot of ways, the context is just as much a significant property of a record as the content itself. And then again, there is a need to preserve both. You can't just focus on preserving the content and not the context as well, or you're going to result in the loss of a lot of information which can be useful to researchers and can help preserve the records long term. Okay, so here we have the characteristics of digital objects that must be preserved over time in order to ensure the continued accessibility, usability, and meaning of the objects and their capacity to be accepted as evidence of what they purport to record. So obviously you need to preserve the content in order for something to be accessible, right? Otherwise, you know, you're providing access to nothing, essentially. You're not going to have a record that is very usable if the content doesn't exist. It's going to be more difficult to derive meaning from an object if you aren't able to interact with the content of that object and see what it is. Looking at context, oftentimes knowing the meaning of an object depends on the context, knowing the who, what, where, when, and why surrounding it. And if you lose this context, then knowing the meaning of an object or why it was created can be a lot more difficult, and that can really undermine the usability of records as well. And context is really important if a record seeks to be accepted as evidence of what they purport to record. So there needs to be an illustration of how the content relates to other content. There needs to be evidence of the provenance of a record. There needs to be evidence of any changes that the record has undergone. And all these things are represented in contextual information, whether it be metadata or other forms of documentation. Okay, so looking at the next one, technical characteristics agreed by the archive to be most important for preserving the digital object over time. Not assumed to be empirical, archives will make judgments at levels appropriate to fulfill their preservation responsibilities and meet the needs of the archive's user community. So this would say that the content and context that archives choose to identify as being significant is going to depend on not necessarily some sort of one-size-fits-all definition or understanding of the significant property of a certain record in a certain format, but rather it's going to depend on the preservation responsibilities that a specific archive has and the needs that a specific archive's user community has. So it really talks about significant properties as not being an objective concept or an objective thing, but rather one that is subjective to a particular archive and even within particular collections within an archive. So it's really interesting to think of this idea of significant properties as being a fairly flexible one. So maybe for one collection, you would say, we want to preserve these aspects of this type of record. And for another collection, you would say, we're not as interested in preserving these significant properties as much. We're more willing to accept that records within this collection may not be as authentic as records in another collection. And again, that's just going to depend on the preservation responsibilities of the archive and the needs of the archive's community. Now, the Becker article cautions that working with commonalities has to be considered given the bulk of modern digital records. So, in some ways, having an objective standard over what is a significant property within your archive and within the greater archive profession is helpful. But I also feel like it's good to have a little bit of flexibility and a little subjectivity built into this discussion as well, because again, archives are going to differ from each other. Researchers and users of archival materials are going to differ from archive to archive. So it's helpful to have this understanding of significant properties as being one that, again, is more content specific and not just this sort of unyielding foundational truth. And that can be true for both the content and the context. Okay, those components of a digital object deemed necessary for its long-term preservation. Obviously, again, you need to preserve the content because that's essentially what you're preserving, but again, also the context as well. If the goal is to provide access to records that have a certain level of authenticity, that have a certain level of utility and usefulness for researchers. Then again, you have to have this contextual kind of backbone and structure to support the content. Okay, and then those properties of digital objects that affect their quality, usability, rendering, and behavior. Again, you have to have both the content and the context. Records without context, again, aren't terribly useful. They may not be, they really aren't of high quality because they are missing the who, what, where, when, and why. With rendering and behavior, it's helpful to know what factors are influencing these. So it's helpful to know that the records may have been migrated in the past, and so they may render in a different way than they did originally. They may behave in a different way than they did originally because of preservation actions, which are described, at least ideally, in the contextual information attached to records. So again, you can't just focus on the content, and you really do need to think about the significant properties of context as well, and make sure that you're capturing the whole picture, because if you are just basing all of your discussions and deliberations around significant properties based on just content alone, you are missing a big piece of the puzzle as far as what archivists should be and are expected to preserve into the future. It's interesting to think of the significant properties that an archive chooses to preserve as its preservation intent, which is something that was mentioned in the NAR article that we looked at when we discussed file format. So essentially saying, these are the characteristics of a record that we intend to preserve in order to make the record accessible and usable and high quality and easy to understand into the future. So you're saying, we are going to try to preserve these aspects of the content and of the context as well. And that's sort of the aim of our digital preservation theories or actions. It's really, really interesting to look at the Owens chapter this week, where the author talked about different platforms just within a disk drive and how different significant properties can be derived just from records on a hard drive that are sort of interacted with and dug into by archives. So when you think about which things are usable or provide quality to records, you kind of have to think a little bit imaginatively and think about how it might be important to preserve information and make information accessible that you may not necessarily even think of as being something that researchers or even archives can access, much less want to use. So the idea of having information on a hard drive that may have been deleted, but may still be recoverable. Looking at some additional information that might be hidden on files that are contained in a hard drive. So it can be difficult for archives to know exactly what these significant properties are and exactly what they need to preserve. So to look, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute, but to talk a little bit more about significant properties, I want to look at the National Archives and Records Administration Preservation Action Plan for email. And we looked at one of these for our discussion for file formats also, but it's important to bring them back because this is essentially NARA's determination of what the significant properties of email are. So what NARA should try to preserve about email records. So it talks a little bit about what email is, and then it goes down into the essential characteristics of email records. So these are the aspects of email that NARA says are really important to preserve in order to support the quality and usability and just sort of greater understanding of records. So they talk about the font or the appearance of the message, and then they get into a little bit more detail. So they say font information inclusive of bolding, italics, etc. would apply, color, orientation, etc. would not apply. So even within font, being more specific about which characteristics of the font NARA feels are important to preserve. Okay, and then it talks about this applies only to the messages, attachments, or handled as separate objects. So they talk about a layout, and then they say in which more than just the discernible data elements themselves provide meaning. So looking at how emails are formatted and how they're structured, and that would be an aspect of emails that NARA wants to preserve. Any markup within the body itself, which can be helpful to maybe get more detail about what the message is or what the message was saying. Looking at the structure, so if there are links and connections to other calendars or meetings or emails, making sure that that is maintained. Original order, if emails come in some type of folder or mailbox, then that is something that NARA want to preserve as well as possible. They talk about behavior. So here they say this is something that we can't really judge. We don't really know how the user interacted with email because there's nothing within emails that really tell us what this interaction was like. And then there is some contextual information as well. So then we have content, and then we have context. So again, getting back to the need to preserve both of these. Having the subject, any keywords, who the originator was, and that can help establish provenance, which is certainly an important thing for archives to have. So some really sort of fundamentally important information that this information provides. Again, some more information that provides provenance. So the host or domain name used by whoever was sending the email. Again, some more provenance information. So all this contextual information, again, really improves the quality of the record. It can establish the provenance of the record and just does a lot of great things that is helpful for an understanding of these email messages and why they were sent and so on. Who might have replied to the record or who the message might be in reply to. So all kinds of useful and important information. So we can see this process where archives receive records, or they work with donors, and they make an attempt to identify the records and to capture information about the record. So capture and understand the significant properties that a record contains. And so this can really provide archivists with an understanding of the content and the context of the record. So just a sort of a general understanding of of what the record is and the different aspects of that particular record. And then what archives can and really should do next is to work with experts, to work with researchers, and to work with stakeholders. So have a nice collaborative process where they determine which of the properties of a record are important. So which records or which aspects of a record are the ones that are significant and are aspects of a record that should be preserved long-term into the future. And coming out of this should be a lot of documentation. So documentation of this collaborative process, of this interaction with experts and researchers and stakeholders that went into deciding what the significant properties of record are, and then of course a documentation of what significant properties or of what properties are determined to be significant, or which aspects of a record archives are most concerned with preserving. And this can be great for transparency. It can be great for kind of showing your math and letting your stakeholders and letting the public and letting researchers know why you made the decisions about which aspects of a record were significant and why you decided that you weren't going to be as focused on other aspects of a record. So maybe why NARA decided that it was important to know if records were bolded or italicized, but it didn't matter what font or what color a font was in. So why did they make that decision? You know, it's not clear from the documentation that we saw. You know, there might be something somewhere that documents, you know, why NAR made that decision. You know, we just don't know that based on that one document. But, you know, people might be curious about, okay, well, maybe the color of a certain font does indicate something about the context or content of a particular record. So that's just something that, you know, why you chose one thing instead of another is something that you want to be able to defend and, again, kind of show your math and show why you made the decisions that you did make. And then once you make a decision about which properties of a record are significant, you need to put that into action, and you need to create a preservation plan, which we discussed earlier on in the semester, that that is going to support the decisions that you made. So your decisions about migration, your decisions about how records are going to be preserved, you know, where they're going to be stored, what kind of metadata you're going to attach to them. You know, everything that you do should support the decisions about the significant properties of records that you come through, or that you come to through this collaborative process. A big thing to consider, as with most things that archives do, is possible use. So you really want to keep in mind what is going to be important to the people that use our archive. What do our researchers want to see? And again, that's something that you can hopefully get out of this collaborative process. So you probably want to have a collaborative process that you know, is really open and involves a lot of input from people from a variety of different backgrounds. You know, that may be less feasible for some archives than others, but you know, it's a good idea to at least attempt that, because that way you are going to result in your archives making an effort to preserve information that people are actually interested in and that people want to use. The Becker article asked some interesting questions about significant properties. So it touches on questions like, do digital objects have distinguishable properties? Do sets of digital objects have common distinguishable properties? Is the question whether any of these properties are significant a decidable question a priori in a given context, in an absolute sense or not at all, and who gets to decide? So if you look at that NARA preservation action plan that we just looked at, NARA is saying, yes, digital objects do have distinguishable properties. And we would argue that all emails have common distinguishable properties. They do have certain types of content and context. And it's not really clear if they have decided that these significant properties are true for every email, or if they are interested in these particular significant properties because of the context of NARA and NARA's mission, and the reason why NARA exists, and the type of researchers and other users that use NARA. And again, that would be something that would be interesting to learn more about, and interesting to see if that's available and other sort of documentation that NARA has, and ideally makes public. So who gets to decide? Again, it's not really clear what kind of collaborative process NARA went through in developing these significant characteristics. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that there was some collaboration with experts and researchers and stakeholders. Again, I can't necessarily say that's true because that information wasn't immediately available to us. But based on the article that we read for our discussion of file formats, it does seem like they have something, some kind of process in place, which does involve public input and collaboration. So I'm going to guess that it was a collaborative process, but again, we don't know for sure. So, and then there's the documentation of their decisions about what the significant properties of an email are. And then they take preservation actions to support that contention, that these are the aspects of emails that should be preserved. And so we're going to structure our preservation actions around doing that. So just kind of take that preservation action plan that we looked at and connect it to these different steps in the process of determining what significant properties are. Okay, so one way of identifying the significant properties of a record is to run a tool like Droid. So you can run a Droid report, and you can get all kinds of useful contextual information about the record. You can get information about the type of file format that the record was created or that the record is in. You can look at when it was last modified. You can look at its size. You can look at the file extension. You can get a little bit of provenantial information. You can get a checksum, which is an alphanumeric representation of the record's bit stream. So, that's just a really kind of basic way to discover what the significant properties of record are. And then you say, okay, so which of these properties are really important for understanding this record and for the quality of the record and for the preservation of this record? And then you can kind of go through these one by one and say, okay, we're not really concerned about the size. If something happens, say we migrate a file and the size of the file changes, if there's some compression, which the Owens article talks about, that's not really something that we're too concerned about. if the format changes, and so on. So once you identify the different aspects and characteristics of a record, then you can go through the process of deciding which ones are actually significant and which ones you're actually going to structure your preservation plan around preserving into the future. And what's great about this contextual information is that it can be exported to a CSV file, which is very widely accessible. And you're not going to have any problems preserving this contextual information just because there are so many applications that use or that can open CSV files, and it's not really a file that you're going to be worried about opening, in 10 or 20 or 50 years. So that's definitely a virtue about contextual information, is that it is so significant and it is so important, and also it's really easy to preserve. So it's kind of a win-win. Okay, so now that we've talked about significant properties, let's talk about file formats. So here we have this process where a record is created with certain significant properties in a certain format. And over time, the record may change because of preservation actions that archives do, such as migration, or maybe due to inaction. It may be because files have sat on a hard drive in the stacks for 10 or 15 years before they were even looked at, and there's been some degradation of the files and degradation of the physical media, and that has resulted in the significant properties of a record being changed. And so anytime these significant properties are changed, the authenticity of records are impacted. So the record may not be as it originally was. There may be actions or inactions that have caused the behavior or the appearance, the look and feel of the record to change. And because of the difference between how the record looks and feels now versus how the record looked and felt when it was created, that can impact the authenticity of the record. Now, it may be that these changes don't matter. It may be that the changes are relatively insignificant. It may be that even if there are significant changes, researchers or users just don't really care that these changes have occurred. So authenticity is important in some respects, but in another respect is something that researchers are sometimes or even often willing to sacrifice for the sake of ease of use or accessibility. And that's something that the Headstrom article for this week discusses a little bit, and also does a good job of describing this sort of collaborative process that that archives can go through when determining what the significant properties of a record are as well. It may be that changing the format of a record can have quite a bit of impact on the significant properties. And that's something that the Low article for this week talked about, about taking these really multi-dimensional artist books and trying to translate them into digital form, and how that really detracted from the quality of the record, from the usability of the record, and really led a lot of people to question how useful these digital artist books are, especially when compared to analog ones. But again, that's not necessarily going to be the case. There may be some loss of information due to compression, which is something that the Owens chapter mentions. But again, in the grand scheme of things, these changes may not matter, and there may not be too much of an impact on the authenticity of a record. So how much is too much? Again, that's something that is going to have to be determined by the archive through collaboration with researchers and other stakeholders. Uh, but it's really important that archives have some kind of, again, some kind of documentation that states we're willing to accept these losses to authenticity because we feel like uh, the sacrifice is worth it for whatever reason, because of an increase in accessibility, um, because of the fact that it's more sustainable to have server space for JPEG files as opposed to TIFF files, or whatever the rationalization may be. Another great thing about contextual information attached to a record is it can support authenticity even if the significant properties of the record have changed. So you can use this contextual information to trace a path back to the original creator and conditions under which a record was created and used. So even if the content has changed because of preservation actions by the archives, or inaction by the archives or the person that created the records, if there is some information about the record as close to its original creation as possible, then archives can say, okay, well, here's what the record looks like now because of these changes, but here's the original format of the record. Here's the original bit stream of the record. Here is the original size of the record. And so contextual information really allows archives to kind of go back in time, and if an archives doesn't have a visual representation of the content as it was created, at least they have an understanding through metadata and other contextual information of what the record looked like as close to its creation as possible. So these changes aren't the end of the world, assuming that there is some documentation of the record that, again, allows archives to provide information to researchers about what the record looked like originally, to to the extent possible. Obviously, words can't really portray what the colors of a picture or an image look like, or the sound of a WAV file as opposed to an MP3, but at least it gives some indication of the original circumstance of the record's creation. And again, can do that in a fairly economical and easy to preserve way. So again, another illustration of the importance of preserving contextual information and how that should be considered a significant property of a record. So how can we connect the idea of significant properties to the idea of permanence that we talked about? So if these are the significant properties of a record, and these are the aspects or characteristics of a record that the archive is able to preserve over time, then these records have a high degree of permanence. These are very authentic records that have a high degree of permanence and are likely to be very valuable to researchers. So you have the content in an original format as possible. You have the context. You have things like the file format remaining the same. You have the bit depth remaining the same. So there's a high degree of permanence to this record. Yes, I'm Batman. We know. If you have a record like this, where only the content has been preserved over time, and other significant properties like the context, the file format, the bit stream or the bit depth have changed over time, then it is a record with an overall low degree of permanence. And it is a record that is less authentic and may be less useful for researchers. There's just less information that shows researchers what the record was like when it was originally created and used by the creator and user of the record. So as we talked about before, obviously maintaining all this as authentically as possible can require a lot of resources. It can require increased storage. It can require expertise and skill. It can require time spent working with donors to make sure that all these things are preserved in the first place before they make it in the archives. This is something that's going to require less resources to just kind of focus on the content and not focus as much on preserving these other aspects of a record, even if they are significant. So this is kind of the emaciated machinist Christian Bale level of permanence, which we talked about before. So having connected significant properties and authenticity to the idea of permanence, let's go ahead and connect them to the concept of ingest, which we've talked about earlier on in this class. So prior to ingest, it's possible for archives to appraise records on the presence or authenticity of significant properties. So if they see records that have changed over time and there really isn't any contextual information to illustrate what those changes are and when they took place and why they took place, then that might impact the appraisal decisions that an archivist makes. They may say, well, you know, these records have changed a lot. It's really difficult to prove their authenticity because there's no documentation of these changes. There really isn't any contextual information about who created and who used these records. So the quality of the records might be very low because of the lack of these significant properties or changes to these significant properties. So we're gonna pass on collecting these records. Relatedly, you could say that prior to ingest, archivists should be proactive about working with donors to make sure that donors are creating metadata, to make sure that donors are keeping multiple copies of records, to make sure that donors are providing additional contextual information to records, again, to either keep these significant properties as stable over time, or to have contextual information that at least describes how the records have changed over time and how these significant properties of records have been impacted by these changes. So documenting any changes to file formats, documenting any anything that might impact the authenticity of the record. You know, these are good things for archives to know, and having this information can really improve the overall quality of the record. Another thing that archives can do prior to ingest is to work to influence the records created and donated, so that the records can be presented in an authentic way. So working so that records are created that are in a format that is easy for archives to archive, and also easy for archives to provide access to. And if archives can't provide access to record in the same format, they can provide access to records in a format that is pretty darn close. So a JPEG is essentially a TIFF that has had some compression done to it. I think these days it's even possible to have JPEGs that don't result in the loss of any information. They're just a smaller file overall. So encouraging donors to create and use file formats that are easy for archives to preserve and provide access to in a way that isn't going to result in a lot of changes to the record's significant properties. So if you go from a TIFF to a JPEG, there might be some impact, but it's going to be pretty minimal. And the significant properties of a digital image in a TIFF format aren't really going to change a whole lot if they're transferred to a JPEG. And that's what archives want. Because if you're going to provide access to something, ideally, it's going to be as close to the original format as possible, right? And this is an instance where that is possible. If donors are creating files in a file format that is maybe proprietary or uncommon or a little difficult and bizarre to work with, then this translation might result in more substantial changes to the significant properties of a record. So if you're transferring a sound file from an MX8 file format to an MP3, then there might be a lot of changes to the sounds that are contained in one file as opposed to another. And that's something that researchers might, that might be something that can detract from the usefulness and value of the record that researchers are ultimately interacting with. So if you were to, say, be able to collaborate with researchers on the front end and having them working with WAV files, which are pretty easy and pretty standard, and then those WAV files were migrated to MP3s for access, that's going to result in some compression and some loss of information, but not as drastic as if it was a change from a more proprietary, a more exotic, a more tricky format for archives to deal with. So a lot of proactivity can really help archives not only maintain and document the significant properties of records, but also provide access to records in a file format that closely mirrors the significant properties of the record as the record was being created and used by the creator / donor. And again, that's something that archives should really shoot for. And another important thing is to have a discussion and some kind of collaboration with the community and with researchers to say, if we transfer something from a WAV file to an MP3, is that still going to meet your needs? Or should we make an effort to provide access, to provide access to a WAV file? If we transfer something from an MX8 file to an MP3, is that going to make the file unusable for you? Do you need to access it in a different file format, or how is this transformation going to impact your ability to use the records? And if your researchers and if the public says, yes, this is really going to detract from the usefulness of our records, then you as an archive should really think about an alternative file format to use for access, which doesn't result in as many changes to the file's significant properties. Okay, so next, let's spend a little bit of time talking about file formats. So what was interesting in the Owens chapter is the author talked about how file formats themselves may be a significant property, as they can indicate information about the creator's intent. So if as Owen notes, if a records creator keeps their files in a .wav format, which is lossless, then that really suggests that they're concerned about the quality of their files, and that may reflect something about their intent for the file and what the file is ultimately going to be used for. So the uh, the file format that records are in can tell you a little bit of contextual information about the record itself. And again, that may be significant for researchers to know and understand. You know, it may not be significant at all, but again, as an archive, you should have some way of knowing whether it's going to be important or not. Another thing that the Owens chapter notes is that file formats instruct computers on how to render files. So if you change a record's file format, it's going to result in a computer opening a file in a different way, and that can impact how the record is rendered, and that can have impacts on the look and feel of a record, and you know that can result in a change to the record's significant properties. And also compression. So kind of relatedly, changing file formats can also cause compression, which can result in a loss of information, and this too can impact the significant properties of a record. So yeah, it's really interesting for me to think of the file format of a record as being a significant property, potentially the record itself. So that's how meta you can get with this stuff. So I thought that was um, an interesting point that the Owens chapter made. So interesting question to ask when it comes to digital preservation is, can archivists provide what we preserve? So as the Owen article states, aspects of records may be changed by how they're rendered by different platforms. So different browsers will represent records in different ways. Different software will represent records in a different way. So if I have a TIFF and you have a TIFF, and if you access that TIFF online and you use Firefox to open that TIFF, and I use Chrome, what you see may be different from what I see. If you are working on iOS, the Apple's operating system, and I'm working with Windows, that may result in files being rendered in a different way. The CEDL article talks about how even monitors can impact the colors that the public sees. So if you have a different monitor than I do, or your monitor is calibrated in a different way that mine is, that can result in you seeing something different from what I see. So there are a lot of things that can impact how significant properties are interacted with and perceived by researchers, even if the original look and feel of a record is maintained by archives and accessible by the public. So if an archives provides access to a record with significant properties that are very similar to the significant properties of the record when it's created, it may not matter, because due to the way that the files are rendered, or due to the hardware or software that we're using, there may still be changes to the significant property. So it may lead archives to wonder, well, why are we worried about providing access to or preserving significant properties when they may be accessed in a way which impacts their authenticity and impacts the look and feel of the record? And there's really nothing that archives can do about that, right? Archives can't mandate that everyone looks at access files from an archives, on a particular type of monitor with a certain calibration, using a certain software, and using a particular browser with a certain renderer, right? It's impossible for archives to do. So, and this is going to be especially acute when it comes to viewers of online records, because they're the ones that are going to have this interface of browser and operating system and and hardware between them and the record. But that's like a lot of archival users, right? People are really keen on accessing archival records online, but again, this can have a lot of impacts to the authenticity and the significant properties of a record. So why worry about preserving the significant properties of a record at all if what people interact with doesn't really resemble an authentic representation of these significant properties? This is something that, it's a fair question. If an archives could have it so that records were accessible on a workstation in the archive and the records were in their original format and the hardware was legacy hardware that correlated with the hardware that was used to create and access the record in its original format, then that would be great. People would be interacting with the records in a very authentic way in which the significant properties were largely the same as they were when the record was created and used. But again, that's going to be few and far between the cases where that is possible. But I think that there are still a lot of virtues for archives to focus on preserving significant properties at all. So first of all, it can provide a goal and structure to digital preservation. It provides archives with some goal to attain, some standard to meet, some way to structure the preservation actions that an archive undertakes, because otherwise, why make any decision about a particular way to preserve records, If you're not going to be worried about maintaining a certain level of authenticity, if you're not going to be worried about maintaining a certain level of authenticity, then why not just do anything for digital preservation, So the concept of significant properties really can provide a lot of structure and a set of goals for digital archivists to preserve when making preservation decisions and actions. Another positive is that it can increase the likelihood that researchers can interact with a closer approximation of a more original record. So even if there is this interference by renderers and software and hardware, having records that maintain the significant properties of a record accessible is going to make it at least more likely that what researchers look at is going to be relatively close to an authentic representation of the record when the original creator created and used it. Again, it's not going to be perfect, but it's better to get things as close as you can than to just say, well, we don't care at all, and let's just kind of put something online and who cares. So just generally speaking, having the idea of what the significant properties of record are and having an idea of what archives should preserving increases the likelihood that archivists can meet researcher and stakeholder needs. So especially if there's a nice collaborative process that goes on to work with donors and work with experts and researchers and the public to make that determination. If archives, again, just don't really have any structure or thought to why they're doing what they're doing, then there's a decreasing likelihood that what they come up with is going to meet the needs of anyone. And if that's the case, then why preserve anything at all? So having this defined set of properties that should be preserved and basing that on a collaboration with the public and with researchers and with experts makes it more likely that usable quality records are going to survive and be accessible in one form or another in the future. And that certainly beats the alternative. And again, changes to aspects of the record may not matter. If people view records and the significant properties are slightly different than what they were when the record was originally created, that might not be such a big deal, especially if that's weighed against enhanced access. So you just have to think about, is it better to provide provide limited access to records with a higher degree of authenticity and a higher preservation of significant characteristics? Or is it better to provide broad access to records with a lower degree of authenticity and potentially uh, substantial changes to the significant characteristics of a record? That's an open question, and I'm sure it's one that's been debated a lot in archives. Most archivists would probably say access is king, even if records aren't incredibly authentic. And with particular collections, you might say we really need to keep the stuff as authentic as possible and keep it accessible in formats as accessible as possible. And that's really what we're going to focus on. So yeah, again, it just kind of depends on the context and needs of varying archives, and however they come through that, however they come to a decision about that balance, is going to depend from situation to situation. What's also great is, again, even if the content is impacted by a variety of ways that records are rendered, the context would not be. The context can, again, describe the technical, administrative, and descriptive aspects of records, even if the significant properties have changed. So if researchers are looking at an excess copy that has been migrated and they're doing it through a monitor and a browser and an operating system that is going to impact the significant properties of the record they're looking at, as long as they can look at metadata associated with a record and say, okay, I understand that what I'm looking at is slightly different from how the record was when it was originally created. And they can either say, I'm fine with that, I accept that loss and kind of move on from there. Or they say, well, I would really like to access a more authentic copy of this record. So let me contact the archive and see if I can come in and look at that, or how that access might take place. So again, it just speaks to the importance of preserving contextual information, and how contextual information is as much a significant property of records as the content of the record itself. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop there. I think I've just about reached the hourly limit I like to set on these lectures. So yeah, the discussion about authenticity and significant properties is an important one, because ideally it serves as the basis for every preservation action that an archives takes during digital preservation. And it can really shape what researchers have to access both now and in the future. So it's a very vital consideration for archivists to make, a very vital discussion for archivists to have within the archive, and also with the general public and with experts and with researchers. And the end goal is to provide records that are useful for the public, and thinking about what aspects of record are useful for the public and preserving those aspects as much as possible is a really important thing for archives to do. And also making sure that that these decisions are documented, and that they are actually reflected in action. If you identify significant characteristics of a record and then you do nothing to really preserve them, then okay, that was a real great use of your time. So you have to follow up your decisions about what's important within a record or within a set of records with actions to support those decisions. And in doing so, you will hopefully create a corpus of records which is more likely to meet the needs of your researchers, and thus be more valuable to your institution, and to society as a whole. So, okay, we'll stop there. Please let me know if you have any questions, and take care of yourselves.